It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. This week, we're going to look at another Guillermo del Toro film. If Hellboy made a particular splash for him in 2004, then 2006's Pan's Labyrinth showed his full ability to create an incredibly immersive world, as well as show how great he is at storytelling. Pan's Labyrinth is a dark fantasy that is influenced by fairy tales, and del Toro himself often considers the film to be a parable as well. The idea of this movie comes from the notebooks that del Toro keeps. Each notebook is usually full of doodles, ideas, drawings, and random plot threads. These notebooks have been kept by him since the 80s. Ultimately, del Toro uses a creature known as a faun, F-A-U-N, as a central idea. Now, fauns are from Roman mythology. They are the horned, often half-human, half-goat deities of the forest. And they're often seen in the forest playing flutes and carrying a bag or a satchel or something like that. Now, the Spanish title of this film references fauns directly. If we were to translate it perfectly, it would be something like The Labyrinth of the Fauns. However, in places like English-speaking places, German-speaking places, and French-speaking places, the title references the Greek god Pan directly. Now, the faun in this movie is not Pan, or is never thought to be that character from Greek mythology. And I have a feeling that it was titled this way to make it a little bit more recognizable to those other countries. Now, it also comes from del Toro's experiences with lucid dreaming when he was a kid. Apparently, he would dream that he always woke up at midnight and would be met by a faun that would come out from behind his grandfather clock. Now, originally the faun was this normal top half human, bottom half goat creature that has a lot of beauty in his looks. Now, he would eventually turn that into one that's more made from like rocks and bark and trees and earth for the movie. However, either which way, the idea of lucidly dreaming that you're meeting up with this mythical creature that's half goat, half human doesn't inspire a great deal of comfort in my mind if you think about it. And if you catch my drift there. Also, del Toro would say that the faun would give off this impression of trustworthiness, but also would raise several red flags. And that doesn't necessarily make me feel any less terrified about this faun character. Now, there are lots and lots of ideas in this movie as well. Del Toro specifically set this during the Spanish Civil War, and that is able to really kind of take advantage of the Francoists as authoritarian villains. He also has lots of references to the Catholic religion as well in the movie. However, some of the undertones are open for discussion as there are some debate over the meanings that are in play here. Also, it's left open for discussion whether or not what the main character of Ophelia is experiencing with these mythical creatures is actually really happening in the world or all part of her imagination. Del Toro always says that it really should be a matter of personal discussion. In the end, the movie was exceptionally well reviewed and performed rather well at the box office, bringing in 4 times its budget. It ended up getting nominated for 6 Academy Awards. Del Toro himself was nominated for both Best Foreign Language Film and Best Original Screenplay. The score was also nominated, as well as the cinematography, art direction, and makeup all being winners of the 3 awards that the movie would receive. And it is absolutely worthy of those Oscars. It also scored big on critics' top 10 list of 2006. At least 35 critics named it to the top 10 of the year, with both Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times and Richard Corliss of Time magazine both among critics placing Pan's Labyrinth at number 1. In 2010, the British publication Empire magazine named it number 5 in the list of the 100 best films of world cinema. So this movie opens with a brief fairy tale about a girl named Moana. She lived in the underworld and dreamed of going to the surface world. And when she escaped by slipping her guard detail and made her way to the surface, She was ultimately blinded by the sunlight and her memory was erased. Worse, she became mortal and eventually growing old and dying. Her father, the king of this underworld, always believed that she'd come back one day. Even in a different body, her soul would return and would be eternal. The movie then shifts to 1944, where we pick up the story of Ophelia, a little girl who is fascinated by fairy tales. She's traveling with her pregnant and sickly mother, Carmen, to the estate of her new stepfather, Captain Vidal. The captain is a member of the Francoists and a firm believer in phalangism. Now, for those without a deep understanding of the history of Europe or other social studies, phalangism is basically a deeply nationalist and racialist group. In short, they thought Spain was pretty awesome and that each race in the human species were ostensibly different with various strengths and weaknesses. Exactly how synonymous racialism is with racism can be up for debate, but it is extremely easy for these two ideas to cross over significantly. On the way to the captain's home, Ophelia comes across a flying stick bug that she believes is a fairy. When she sees the same bug again on the captain's land, she follows it into a labyrinth. That first night, the stick bug comes into the room where she and her mother are sleeping, and Ophelia shows a picture of a classic fairy to the bug, and it transforms itself into that image of a fairy that we all recognize. It leads her out into the labyrinth again and into the center where there's a spiraling staircase that goes into the underworld. When she gets there, she meets a faun who believes that she is the long-lost Moana returned after so many years. He gives her a book to read whenever she's alone that will basically show her what 3 tasks she must do before the next full moon in order to return to the underworld. Her first task is to climb into the heart of a very old fig tree to retrieve a key from the belly of a gigantic frog. However, in order for the frog to give her the key, he has to vomit up his entire innards for her, which ultimately deflates him as well. It's kind of weird and gross, but also kind of cute. While carrying out that first task, not only is Ophelia dirtied, but she also finds out that a very pretty dress that her mother made for her to wear while they attend a dinner party put on by the captain for various dignitaries was ruined. This disappoints Carmen, but Ophelia gets a little joy out of her mother's comment that this will hurt Vidal more than anyone else. Before she can start her next quest for the faun, complications with Carmen's pregnancy causes Ophelia to delay. The faun comes and delivers a mandrake root to help Ophelia's mother and issues the next quest, along with a warning. First, he gives her a piece of chalk, and that's basically used for her to draw a doorway into this next place where this next quest will take place. On this quest, she will see a wondrous feast, but she also must not eat anything, for her life will depend upon it. Now, at this dining room area where this feast is happening, she sees the Pale Man, which is this inhuman creature whose eyes are in the palms of his hands. Now, the fairies help her realize that she must use the key that she got from the frog to open a safe in the Pale Man's wall to retrieve a dagger. However, she must hurry before the sands of an hourglass runs out that will also close down the doorway that she made with her chalk. She also has to resist the lovely food on this long dining table. When she eats a grape, despite the fairies warning her about this awakens the Pale Man. And the Pale Man eats 2 of the fairies and then chases after Ophelia. Worse, the hourglass runs out and she's trapped in this hallway with the Pale Man bearing down on her. She's forced to create another doorway with her chalk to escape, which she barely does. When she returns to the real world, Ophelia overhears Vidal tell his doctor that if the doctor has a choice between saving the baby or Carmen, the baby is to be born to carry on Vidal's name. Later, a rebel attack that ultimately leads to much of the rations that Vidal keeps in his barn being stolen by way of an extra key being used on the lock to break in. That reveals a traitor in his midst. Worse, when the faun realizes that Ophelia ate 2 grapes which led to the deaths of 2 of his fairies, he swears to her that she will never be allowed to return home, and all memory of her will fade as well as the magical creatures. Things only get much, much worse for Ophelia. When Vidal catches her tending to the mandrake, he begins scolding her himself, but leaves it to Carmen to issue punishment. And she tosses the root into the fire, causing her to immediately go into painful contractions. Carmen dies giving birth to Vidal's son. At this time, Vidal also realizes that Mercedes was the informant and traitor that were helping the rebels. She tries to escape with Ophelia, but they are caught. Now, Mercedes is able to ultimately escape by stabbing Vidal and ends up joining up with some rebels, but it requires the Faun to have a change of heart to send Ophelia on her third quest for her to get away from her imprisonment. The Faun tells Ophelia to collect her brother and bring him to the Labyrinth. She asks why, but the Faun only says that they have need of him. She's able to grab her brother and escapes into the Labyrinth with Vidal in pursuit. The Faun says that he needs a small amount of the baby's blood to complete the ritual to bring her back to the underworld, but she refuses. Vidal sees Ophelia at the center of the labyrinth, and while she's speaking to the Faun, he doesn't see her speaking to anyone. He's able to take the child from her and shoots Ophelia. When he exits the labyrinth, he's surrounded by the rebels, and he gives his son to Mercedes and is killed by the rebels, who swear the child will never know his father's name. Mercedes finds Ophelia barely breathing and bleeding out. Her blood completes the ritual to return her soul to the underworld, where she then awakens as Prince Moana in the throne room, with the king of the underworld explaining that spilling her own blood instead of an innocent meant that she passed the final and most important task. Carmen is there as Moana's mother, and is later revealed that despite Ophelia dying, Moana ruled wisely and left quiet traces of her time in the human realm visible to only those who knew where to look. So let's get to my 3 things that I like about Del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. First, this is a very modern fairy tale complete with magical creatures, a rebellious girl full of imagination, and a terrible step-parent. As opposed to the classic Disney-style fairy tales, it isn't an evil stepmother, but a terrible stepfather who emotionlessly dispatches anyone he believes to be a member of the rebels, and or anyone who ultimately feels like he could potentially become a rebel. He brutally murders a father and son, even though they were telling him the truth, because, well, until he discovered they were being truthful, he had no reason not to believe that they were working against the dictator of Spain, General Franco. Even when he realized he was wrong, he didn't show any remorse for killing them. He's the perfect over-the-top terrible monster of a stepfather and a terrible human being. His servant Mercedes, who was the secret spy for the rebels, feels less a servant and the person who had her home basically taken away from her by the state and given to Vidal so that he and his men could continue flushing out the various rebels. But that's not stated. It's not really implied, but you could make an argument that he just usurped the land for the state and was doing that there because she doesn't really feel like somebody who is employed by him. It almost feels like she's trapped there with him. Second, the creatures in this all feel very, very real. Most of them are practical makeup effects, while others are computer-generated effects. However, you don't doubt for a moment that these things exist in the world with Ophelia. Most anyone who has been aware of Del Toro's work for the past 20 years or so have seen the pictures of the Faun, and I like how he follows that idea that I mentioned earlier that he's made of earth and wood, because when he moves, he creaks. He also doesn't really inspire a great deal of trust when you look at him. Mercedes even mentions that fawns should not really be trusted. However, the creature most everyone knows from this movie is actually inspired by Japanese mythological creatures named the Tenome. This is a creature whose eyes are on the palms of its hands, and it's a truly frightening creature that is called the Pale Man. Now, he's the image that I used for this episode, so look no further than this article on filmseizure.com or for the player that's used in SoundCloud to see what this really scary dude looks like. But I do like that right after you see the pale man and how goddamn terrifying he is, you see Ophelia awaken the mandrake root to help her mother. Now, the faun called the mandrake root the root that dreamt of being human. And when she put it into a bowl of fresh milk like she was instructed, the root unfurls himself and looks like a little baby creature. So you get the super freaky pale man followed up by the cutesy mandrake baby. Finally, this is a very, very, very good movie. It's probably the very best movie that will ever be covered on this show, if I'm being bold with that. That said, it is also a combination of a fascinatingly dense movie while also being somewhat difficult to watch. I mean, the movie ends with a little girl dying, being shot by a cruel, emotionless fascist, basically being bested by the villain. Also, the rebels in which we come to root for because the Francoists are such jerks won't ever really win. They will either be killed off over the years or they will simply fade away under the crushing knowledge that they will not get any real help from anyone in the world. That's a hard pill to swallow, really. And it's sadly a part of history that is not really taught in American schools, but maybe it should be. I mean, unfortunately, because of the time period that the Spanish Civil War and the various struggles that happened afterwards kind of takes place right in the middle of the Great Depression and World War II, which are most often covered in schools. Now, on the other hand, this movie is gorgeous in its sadness. You have the questions of whether or not what Ophelia experienced is real or not. It is obvious from the beginning she is a girl who has dealt with some pretty serious sadness in her life. She lost her father in the Civil War and is being moved from the city to this real jerk's mill on this house that's way out in the middle of nowhere. And she's full of imagination and has a rebellious streak in her. What she is experiencing could be real, but there's a reading here that maybe all of this is how she is dealing with her father dying, her mother being ill, the change of place, and her brother being on the way. It's very likely she's going into her own world to deal with all this stuff a little kid wouldn't know how to compartmentalize properly. And yet I have another reading. The movie opens with a close-up of Ophelia lying on the ground, bleeding out, as she was when Mercedes found her in the labyrinth. At that point, the story of Moana begins, and then it takes us to Ophelia and Carmen on the way to Vidal's home. It's that point that the magical stuff starts. I see this as kind of a Jacob's Ladder type of story. Since we see her basically in her final moments of her life, I think everything we see her dealing with is the last moments of her brain functioning before she died. Most everything in the real adult world was also represented in Ophelia's magical world. The key, which she obtained from the frog, but was also something that Mercedes gave to her brother and the other rebels to get to the rations, that's there. Her being chased by a monster with a knife involved is there, much like how Mercedes stabbed Vidal to get away from him. And basically, all of that is paralleled between Ophelia and Mercedes. The stories meet with the blood of an innocent being spilled. Ultimately, I was wondering throughout the movie if this was the case, but when Carmen was on the throne in the underworld waiting for Moana to return, only sealed the deal for me to believe that this was the afterlife. The king was her real father, and they were waiting for her to arrive. While this seems sad, there's still a sweetness that she's going to someplace magical instead of the shitty world that she was leaving behind. Now, I could talk about this movie for hours, but I think I should probably wrap it up here. Maybe this can someday become a full episode of Film Seizure sometime down the line. But until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.